Ghosts, demons, possessions. We're fascinated by their ephemeral nature and what they represent. They're in our films, our myths, and our stories. Wherever you are, they're a part of our collective subconscious. They're present across the world, from the Japanese Akiryo, a manifestation of a person's dark desires that takes possession of the unaware, or the South Sudanese Apeth, a night witch which seeks to consume the good fortunes of those who wronged it. These aren't objects of superstition relegated to the past. People may still believe in possessions. Even you, dear listener, may tell yourself that these are all old wives' tales, but what if you were confronted with someone speaking in tongues, never breaking eye contact and moving their limbs in a way that you find unnatural? Admit it, you felt just a hint of a shiver at the base of your neck, or maybe your shoulders stiffened a bit. You may not believe in possessions, but something about these visuals unnerves you. Why do ghosts, demons, and possessions consistently pop up across all epochs and cultures, amongst the religious and irreligious? Are they tools that we use to explain what we don't understand? And, more importantly, why are those who become objects of possession-obsession more likely to be of the more vulnerable members of society? Today, we'll be discussing the case of Elisa Lam, a woman who met a mysterious end at a California hotel. Some believe that she was murdered, others that she was a victim of a supernatural entity. But the truth is that her psychological state is being misinterpreted for similar reasons as stated above. Please join me as we explore this phenomena and how it applies to Lam. Welcome to The Witching Hour. Elisa Lam was a Vancouver resident who had taken a sabbatical from her university studies to travel across the West Coast. She eventually found her way to California and then Los Angeles, where she checked into the Stay on Main, an extension of the Cecil Hotel. Her parents became worried after she had missed their daily phone call, something which she had never done before. They filed a missing persons report with the LAPD and flew to the city from Canada to help in the search. Law enforcement did what they could to find Lam. They opened a tip line, distributed flyers, searched areas of the Cecil Hotel which they could without a warrant, and, when all of that failed, they released a video of her last known location, inside an elevator of the Cecil Hotel. Unfortunately, the surveillance video became an infamous source of misinformation. In it, Lam behaves in an abnormal way, that is to say, in a manner that most viewers fail to understand. She hides in corners. She jerks her body with each step. She moves her limbs and extremities erratically. Afterwards, she walks away, forgoing the elevator entirely. Many were led to believe that Lam was being stalked, while others that she was a victim of demonic possession. The video was shared massively on social media and video sharing sites. Within a few days, it was viewed by millions of people across the world. Nothing positive came from its release. Only a wave of true crime voyeurism and theories that misinterpreted signs of mental illness as evidence of the paranormal or murder. It begs the question, where was Lam? What happened to her after she was last seen in the footage? But what I find is more important to answer, why were people so quick to ascribe supernatural meaning to the actions of a sick woman?
Creepy. Weird. Strange.
These words are ones that instinctually pop up when strangers view the video for the first time. I'd also wager that the vast majority of people to whom these terms come to mind are neurotypical. That is to say, people that display normative thoughts and behavior patterns within a given society. I say this because a small minority of those who watched the exact same footage recognized her behavior. They saw themselves. For those who are bipolar or who live with personality disorders, her actions mirrored moments of their own lives. And that's because Lam herself was bipolar. Diagnosed a year prior, she blogged earnestly and openly about her struggles with mental illness. Prior to her diagnosis, she consistently slept for long periods of time, experienced bouts of hypomania, followed by waves of depression. She was open about wanting to end her life at times, albeit in the sardonic aesthetic that has long been popular among Tumblrites. Those living with mental illness are often maligned by their peers. Many are invisibilized, their symptoms too subtle or small to make them targets within society, while others are ostracized and kept at arm's length for not correlating with the perceived normal range of public behaviors. Have you ever avoided sitting in the open seat next to the person arguing with themselves, instead choosing to stand in an overcrowded bus or train? This is a common example of the ostracization that people living with outwards-facing mental illness confront each day. The supernatural is only another facet that neurotypical populations will use to justify their perceptions or prejudices of groups living with psychiatric disorders. It's not a contemporary lens through which their experiences are framed, but one that has deep cultural and historical roots. Theological texts have oft mentioned demonic possessions, whether directly or indirectly.
When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick.
Possessions are present in other religions, in addition to the ones I've mentioned in the introduction. The Quran mentions jinns, otherworldly beings that exist in the background of our mortal world. Other Islamic sources state that they have power over men and can inhabit the bodies of mortals. What anthropologists can tell is that the concept of demonic possessions is a priori to any religious mentions. They can be found across most cultures and in the mystic traditions that preceded the religions. Possessions of the body are folkloric artifacts that have become absorbed into each individual religious canon. While most theologians acknowledge that these creatures and events exist in text and myth only, it hasn't prevented some from projecting their fears onto those who don't fit into their views of what society should be. Scholars have frequently stated that exorcisms, both past and present, have been performed on people whose mental or neurological disorders were falsely presumed to be demonic possessions. Many of the exorcisms that have been popularized over the past century were merely marginalized members of society being abused due to a particular religious prejudice that has persisted even to this day. A study of university graduates and academic professionals in Saudi Arabia found that the majority of respondents attributed epilepsy and epileptic seizures to jinn possessions. It doesn't matter if you're educated or consider yourself cultured. You are vulnerable to, and in turn enforce, normative behaviors and beliefs within your society. Those living with mental illness are crushed by normative expectations to the point where their lives are at risk. In fact, it's impossible to look through the history of mental illness prejudice without seeing a connection to religious bias. One of the most famous real-world examples being that of Anna Elizabeth Michel. Michel was a teenager from Germany who suffered from epilepsy. Her epileptic seizures became more and more severe to the point where it traumatized her temporal lobe. Her personality changed. She became more and more depressed and started having auditory and visual hallucinations. While her parents initially sought out psychiatric help, they eventually contacted the Catholic Church. For over 10 months, Michelle was subjected to 67 separate ritualistic exorcisms, during which she was beaten, drowned, strangled, and starved. She passed away a shade of her former self, weighing just under 30 kilos. And just this month in Sri Lanka, a 9-year-old child had hot oil poured onto them and was beaten to death by their mother, who sought to drive out a demon that had taken possession of them, simply because they were a child who was acting out. In both cases, abnormal behavior was seen as a symptom of the supernatural due to its deviation from the norm. And while it is less frequent than it previously was, symptoms of mental illness or neurological conditions are still attributed to spiritual possession. I believe this is the case when some people speak of Elisa Lam and what had happened to her. Let's return to her case. No one reported seeing her after the timestamp of her last appearance in the elevator footage. It was only after guests began complaining of low water pressure and a foul taste, smell, and discoloration in their drinking water that they found Lam's remains. 19 days after she had gone missing, they found her. Her body was discovered in the water tanks on the roof of the hotel, which stored the building's potable water. She had no bruising on her skin or evidence of trauma. There was no damage to her hands that indicated she attempted to exit the water tank or that she fought someone off. An intact hyoid bone ruled out strangulation. Her toxicology report stated that she only had a blood alcohol content of 0.02, a fraction of the amount needed to be considered inebriated. While you may find more than the odd person convinced that she was a victim of foul play, the reality is that Lam suffered a major depressive episode and, finding herself alone in a strange city without friends or confidants, as well as suffering from medication withdrawal, chose to end her life. Before I continue, I'd like to share that if you are going through a crisis and need help, please visit the International Association for Suicide Prevention's website. You can find the link in the description. There, you'll find a list of suicide crisis hotlines across the world and in the language that you're most comfortable in. It may be difficult for now, but someone's there for you. According to the autopsy report released by the medical examiner, Elisa Lam had traces of 4 drugs in her system: lamotrigine, quetiapine, Wellbutrin, and venlafaxine. All of these drugs work in combination to alleviate the severity of the depressive episodes associated with Lam's bipolar type 2. In other words, and as those on similar medication will recognize, it gave her balance and helped her navigate her day-to-day life. These drugs allowed Lam to live a life in which she slept 8 hours and not 14, where her depression wasn't all-consuming. However, treating personality disorders isn't as easy as popping a couple pills and going on with your day. Each of these medications causes unwanted side effects. Some common side effects on one's mental state shared by most of these drugs are mild confusion, drowsiness, and mental disorientation. For most, these would have been an inconvenience, but for Lam, it would have been a major obstacle. She was a literary bug. She loved to read and engage with literature, always having a book in hand, but what happens if you can't remember what you've just read once you reach the end of a page? It can be a nightmare. Of course, this is mostly conjecture, but there is one kernel of truth in what I've just told you. There were only trace amounts of her daily medication in her system. Lam wasn't taking her prescribed medication in the days leading up to her death. A 2017 peer-reviewed study published in Psychiatric Services found that 74% of respondents within their sample pool, of those who sought to discontinue medication usage, did so due to negative or unwanted side effects. The study was limited to medication users who discontinued 2 or more prescribed drugs that they had been taking for over 9 months. Similar to Lam. That's without mentioning the high prevalence of suicidality among those living with bipolar type 2. A meta-analysis of 24 studies by Frank, Novick, and Schwartz found that nearly a third of those diagnosed have a history of suicide attempts, as well as using significantly more lethal and violent means. All of the existing literature indicates that the likeliest result of that night was that Lam, in withdrawal from her medication and potentially suffering from a psychotic episode, went to the roof to get some air, and once there, made the sudden decision to end her own life. It's tragic, but it's not as supernatural or mysterious as online sleuths would have you believe. Unfortunately, I can't leave it at that. Some of you viewing this video may still be skeptical. For that reason, it's important to contextualize several questions that web sleuths have been asking themselves over the years. Some use the split second of a frame as evidence that someone was preventing the elevator from closing. But isn't it more likely that this is simply a few pixels of her own shoe as she pivots? If someone was standing to the left of the elevator, then why does she peek out to the right, here, and step out facing towards the right, here? If someone was preventing you from leaving and their presence made you anxious, would you really have your back to them? One aspect of the surveillance footage which influenced viewers to consider supernatural factors was the elevator and how it behaved opposite to expectations. Lam enters the elevator and immediately runs her hands down the control panel, hitting a dozen or more buttons. She stands in a corner waiting for the elevator to move, yet it stands still, even after she presses more buttons. Spooky, right? Well, not really. There are 2 possible, very grounded reasons as to why it didn't move. When she pressed every button, it's possible that she had pressed the emergency stop button, which would have prevented the elevator from closing. It's also possible that the elevator that she was using was an older model, one that locked down automatically when too many switches are triggered. And so we return to our obsession with possession. It's something that's continuously centered in societal thought, as we've previously discussed. Moreover, it's a subject for which the average consumer clamors. All it takes is to look at the film industry. The Exorcist is one of the most well-known films in North America. It grossed 37 times its production budget, making it one of the most viewed horror films of all time. Possessions are such a presence in collective consciousness that we've projected them onto real-life incidences for decades, and continue to produce films centering on these events. I've been working on this video since the beginning of the year. When you make videos as a hobby and only have a spare hour or 2 per week to put towards them, they can take a while. During that time, interest in Elisa Lam has been invigorated by a recent true crime series released on Netflix. Most of the series focuses on whether or not Lam was a victim of foul play, and mostly leans towards the former for the duration of its runtime. This exemplifies the sort of negative attention that her death has received. Lam loses her personhood and is objectified. She's no longer an individual, but a mystery. And she's become a case to solve where there is none. And so, what are your thoughts? Do you disagree with what I've shared with you, or do you have other examples of how our obsession with paranormal has led to the marginalization of those living with mental illness? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for listening, and as always, Witching Hour, signing off.